Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. For 43 years, he knew only gilded walls, the whispers of eunuchs, and the chilling silence of a prince awaiting death. This is the story of Ahmed II, the man who stepped out of a cage, the Kafes, and onto the throne of a crumbling empire. At the age of 50, a prisoner his entire life, he was suddenly the most powerful man in the world. But can a man who has never known freedom rule an empire that is losing its own? In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, the epicenter of a world-spanning empire, there existed a suite of rooms unlike any other. They were adorned with Iznik tiles of cobalt and turquoise, floors layered with the finest Anatolian carpets, and ceilings dripping with gold leaf. Sunlight, filtered through intricate latticework, danced upon mother-of-pearl inlay. This was the Şimşirlik, the boxwood garden, but it was known by a more chilling name, the Kafes, the cage. It was not a prison of iron bars and damp stone, but a gilded cage of terrifying luxury. Here, the spare sons of the Ottoman dynasty were kept, sequestered from the world, to await one of two fates, the throne or the silk bowstring of the executioner. The Kafes was born from a brutal necessity. For centuries, the law of fratricide, sanctioned by Mehmed the Conqueror, demanded that a new sultan execute his brothers to prevent civil war. It was a cruel but effective calculus of power. Yet, by the 17th century, this river of royal blood had become too much for the dynasty to bear. The solution was the Kafes, a place of living death, where princes were preserved, not murdered. They were given every comfort but freedom, every lesson but experience. They were surrounded by deaf-mute servants, ensuring their words and plots never left the gilded walls. For a prince born into this system, life began and ended within these opulent chambers. Every footstep in the corridor, every unexpected summons could signal the end. It was a psychological crucible designed to break the mind, to neuter ambition, to transform a potential rival into a harmless recluse. Into this world of silent terror and suffocating beauty, on February 25th, 1643, a prince was born. His name was Ahmed. He would not know the outside world, the feel of a horse beneath him, or the roar of an army. His world would be the cage, and he would become its longest-serving resident. To understand Ahmed II, one must first understand the madness that sired him. His father was Sultan Ibrahim, a man who had spent the first 22 years of his own life in the Kafes, cowering in daily fear of his formidable brother, Murad IV. When Murad died and Ibrahim was summoned to the throne, he was so convinced it was a trick to execute him that he had to be shown his brother's corpse before he would emerge. The throne did not heal him. It merely gave his broken mind an empire to play with. Ibrahim's reign was a fever dream of excess and paranoia. He was obsessed with amber, lining entire rooms with it. He demanded his governors scour the land for the most corpulent women to satisfy his bizarre tastes. He waged a costly and pointless war with Venice over a personal slight. His court was a theatre of the absurd, ruled by the whims of a man whose sanity had been hollowed out by decades of captivity. Ahmed was born into this chaos in 1643. He was not the cherished heir, but merely one of 3 sons born in quick succession to a father who was rapidly spiraling out of control. The palace of his infancy was not a place of stability, but of frantic, unpredictable energy, governed by a sultan who once, in a fit of rage, was rumoured to have ordered his entire harem of nearly 300 women drowned in the Bosphorus. When Ahmed was just 5 years old, the madness became too much for the state to endure. The Janissaries and the ulama, the religious establishment, rose up. Sultan Ibrahim was deposed, thrown back into the very cage he so feared, and, 10 days later, strangled by order of the Grand Mufti. For the young Prince Ahmed, this was his first, indelible lesson in Ottoman power. His father, the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, was not infallible. He could be broken, discarded, and murdered. And for the son of a deposed and executed madman, the golden cage was no longer just a residence. It became a tomb in waiting. With the execution of Ibrahim the Mad, the throne passed to Ahmed's oldest half-brother, who was just 6 years old. He would become Mehmed IV, the Hunter. For Ahmed and his other brother Suleiman, the world shrank permanently to the dimensions of the Kafes. Their lives were now entirely subject to the will and the lifespan of their ruling sibling. The early years were a whirlwind of palace intrigue, dominated not by the boy sultan, but by the titanic rivalry between two women, their grandmother, the formidable Kösem Sultan, and Mehmed's mother, the fiercely ambitious Turhan Sultan. Ahmed and Suleiman were pawns in this deadly game, their existence a constant silent threat. Their value lay only in their potential to replace their brother, should he fall from favor. As Mehmed grew, he solidified his power. He was a vigorous, martial sultan, obsessed with hunting and campaigning. His reign would last for an astonishing 39 years. For Ahmed, this meant decades of watching from behind a latticed screen. He saw his brother lead armies, receive ambassadors, and father children who would live free within the palace while he remained a perpetual captive. He was a ghost in his own home, a prince in name only. His education was carefully curated. He would have studied the Quran, poetry, history, and perhaps calligraphy, but it was all theoretical. He learned of war without ever seeing a battlefield, of governance without ever attending a council meeting, of the world without ever leaving the palace grounds. He and Suleiman were shadows, growing older together in shared confinement. They were companions in misery, yet the system made them inherent rivals. Only one could ever hope to leave the Kafes alive as sultan. Every day was a study in survival, a performance of harmlessness for the guards and eunuchs who watched their every move. For 4 long decades, Ahmed lived under the shadow of his brother, a forgotten prince waiting for a history that seemed as if it would never arrive. 43 years. Imagine the passage of time. 43 winters watching snow blanket the silent courtyards of the Topkapi. 43 springs watching the Judas trees bloom along the Bosphorus, a world away. This was Ahmed's reality. Time in the Kafes was not measured in events, but in the slow, grinding erosion of the soul. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of prayer, study, and quiet contemplation, all overshadowed by the potential for sudden death. What does such an existence do to a man? The fate of his father, Ibrahim, offered one terrifying possibility: a descent into madness, where the walls of the mind crumble just as surely as the physical ones confine the body. Or does one find refuge? Perhaps Ahmed poured his being into his faith, finding in the structured ritual of Islam a certainty his life lacked. Perhaps he became a master calligrapher, channeling his frustrated ambition into the elegant, controlled strokes of a reed pen, creating a perfect, ordered world on paper that he was denied in reality. He was utterly isolated. The servants were spies. His only companion, his brother Suleiman, was also his rival. Theirs must have been a profoundly complex relationship, a shared trauma binding them together, yet the brutal logic of the succession forcing them apart. They were the only 2 people on earth who could understand each other's predicament, yet true trust was an impossible luxury. Then, in 1687, the world outside finally broke in. The disastrous Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Mohacs and the loss of Buda sent shockwaves through the empire. The army mutinied and marched on Istanbul, demanding a scapegoat. Sultan Mehmed IV, after 39 years on the throne, was deposed. But it was not Ahmed who was summoned. It was his brother, Suleiman II. After 40 years in the Kafes, Suleiman was now sultan. For Ahmed, the world had tilted on its axis. He was now the heir apparent. The silence of his cage was broken. He was no longer a forgotten relic. He was a heartbeat away from the throne. The threat of the bowstring had never been more real. While Shehzade Ahmed languished in the gilded silence of the Kafes, the Ottoman Empire, under his brother Sultan Mehmed IV, was marching toward its grandest ambition and its most catastrophic failure. The year was 1683. The air in the Ottoman court crackled with a feverish energy, a belief in destiny rekindled by the formidable Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was a man of immense ambition who saw in Vienna not just a city, but the symbolic heart of Christendom, the golden apple that had eluded even Suleiman the Magnificent. For decades, the empire had been a slumbering giant, but Kara Mustafa was determined to awaken it and hurl its full might against the Habsburgs. An army of staggering proportions, perhaps 150,000 strong, snaked its way across the Balkans, a river of steel, silk, and cannon. It was a vision of imperial power not seen in a century. The siege began with overwhelming force. The city's defenders were vastly outnumbered. Its fall seemed inevitable. From the gilded cage in Topkapi, whispers of the campaign would have reached Ahmed. Perhaps he heard the prayers in the mosques for victory, the confident boasts of courtiers. Did he feel a flicker of pride or a tremor of dread? He, a prince of the House of Osman, was disconnected from its greatest gamble. Then, the unthinkable happened. On the heights of the Kahlenberg, a relief force appeared. A coalition of Christian armies, led by the Polish King John III Sobieski, descended upon the Ottoman camp. The ensuing battle was not merely a defeat, it was a rout, a humiliation that shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Kara Mustafa's grand army dissolved into a panicked mob, abandoning its tents, its cannons, and its honor. The road back to Istanbul was paved with shame. For Mehmed IV, the disaster was a death knell for his reign. For the empire, it was the beginning of a long, painful retreat. And for Ahmed, still waiting in the shadows, the echoes of this colossal failure were the first tremors of a quake that would eventually bring the walls of his own prison crashing down. The disaster at Vienna was not a singular event. It was the first domino to fall in a cascade of catastrophe. The Christian powers of Europe, smelling blood in the water, united in a holy league. Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia launched a coordinated assault on the Ottoman Empire from all sides. The Great Turkish War had begun, and it was a relentless tide of defeat. Buda, the jewel of Ottoman Hungary, held for a century and a half, was lost. Greece fell to the Venetians. The Balkans, the empire's European heartland, were ablaze. The treasury, drained by the Viennese campaign, was empty. The people starved while the army mutinied. In 1687, the simmering rage boiled over. The army, returning broken and bitter, marched on Istanbul and deposed Sultan Mehmed IV. They dragged him from his throne and threw him into the very cafes where his brothers had spent their lives. In his place, they installed his brother, Suleiman II. It was a desperate move, replacing one ruler with a man who had been locked away for nearly 40 years. Suleiman was pious and well-intentioned, but utterly unprepared for the storm he inherited. His mind, shaped by decades of isolation and the constant fear of execution, was not suited to wartime leadership. He valiantly attempted reforms, appointing the brilliant Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha as his Grand Vizier, who managed to stabilize the front. Yet, the empire continued to bleed. Suleiman's reign was a frantic 4-year struggle against collapse. He was a ghost on the throne, haunted by the failures of his predecessor and tormented by his own ill health. In the cafes, Ahmed watched another brother ascend and falter. He saw the futility of placing a long-caged man at the helm of a sinking ship. In June of 1691, Suleiman II succumbed to his ailments. The throne was vacant once more. The empire, still locked in a fight for its very survival, turned its gaze back to the cage, to the last remaining son of Sultan Ibrahim. The door was about to open for Ahmed. The death of a sultan was always a moment of supreme tension, but in 1691, it was a moment of profound desperation. With Suleiman II's passing, The highest officials of the state, led by the formidable Grand Vizier Köprülü, Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the Topkapi Palace. Their destination was the Şimşirlik, the boxwood garden, the dreaded Kafes. For 43 years, this had been Ahmed's entire world. A world of polished marble, intricate tilework, silent servants, and the ever-present shadow of the executioner's bowstring. He had entered as a boy of 5 and was now a man of 48. He had seen his brother Mehmed rule for decades, only to be thrown into the cell next to him. He had seen his other brother, Süleyman, brought out to rule, only to die under the weight of the crown. Now, it was his turn. Imagine the sound of the heavy iron bolts being drawn back, a sound Ahmed had likely never heard from the outside. The groan of the door swinging open, spilling the light of the outside world into his cloistered existence. Standing before him were the pillars of the empire, their faces grim, their bows deep. They were not his jailers anymore. They were his subjects. They proclaimed him Sultan Ahmed II, Padishah of the House of Osman, Caliph of the Faithful. In that instant, a life of absolute powerlessness was exchanged for one of absolute authority. But what was the state of the man who received this power? His skin would have been pale from a life indoors. His eyes, unaccustomed to the vastness of the world, would have blinked in the unfamiliar light. His mind, though educated, was a vessel of theory, completely devoid of practical experience in governance, warfare, or diplomacy. He had never commanded a soldier, debated a law, or even managed a household. He was a scholar of a world he had never been allowed to touch. As he stepped out of the cafes for the first time in over 4 decades, he was not just a new sultan. He was a ghost stepping into the living world, a man freed from one prison only to be handed the keys to an empire that was itself a larger, more chaotic cage. The accession of Ahmed II was not a celebration. It was a grim necessity. The man who now sat on the throne of Osman was a stranger to his own empire. While he was intelligent, pious, and possessed a quiet dignity, he was fundamentally a product of his confinement. His first days were a whirlwind of ceremony and briefings, a deluge of information about a world he knew only from books and whispers. He was surrounded by men who had been running the empire for years, chief among them the Grand Vizier, Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha. This was the true power in the state. Fazıl Mustafa was a brilliant military commander and statesman, the latest scion of the formidable Köprülü dynasty. He had stabilized the government under Süleyman II and was now prosecuting the war against the Holy League with vigor. Ahmed II, in these early days, was more of a symbol than a sovereign. He was the legitimate source of authority, but the wielder of that authority was his Grand Vizier. The Sultan was a prisoner of his own inexperience. He could issue no command without advice, make no decision without counsel. His world had expanded from a few rooms to a vast empire, but his personal agency remained deeply constrained. He was a spectator to his own reign. He showed a keen interest in justice and the welfare of his subjects, poring over petitions and attempting to curb corruption. He was a calligrapher and a poet, a man of refined tastes thrust into an age of brutal warfare. But his personal qualities could do little to stem the tide of the war. The news from the front was relentless and dire. Just 2 months into his reign, the empire suffered another devastating blow. At the Battle of Slankamen, the Ottoman army was shattered, and the brilliant Grand Vizier, Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, was killed. The one man who had shielded the inexperienced sultan from the full weight of the crisis was gone. Now, Ahmed II was truly alone on the throne. The cage of the cafes was gone, but a new, more terrible prison had taken its place. The prison of responsibility without experience, of supreme authority in an empire spiraling towards ruin. Upon the gilded throne sat Ahmed II, a man whose world for 40 years had been the 4 walls of a gilded cage. But the true ruler of the Ottoman Empire in 1691 was not the Sultan, but his Grand Vizier, Köprülüzade Fazıl Mustafa Pasha. He was the last great scion of the formidable Köprülü dynasty, a family of viziers who had, for a time, arrested the empire's decline. On his shoulders rested the crushing weight of a legacy and the desperate hopes of a realm on the brink of collapse. Fazıl Mustafa was a whirlwind of purpose and reform. He understood that the Holy League could not be defeated by piety alone. He overhauled the state's finances, daring to reform the jizya tax to be more equitable, a move that won him support among the Christian subjects but earned him enemies among the corrupt elite. He instilled discipline in the janissaries, purging the roles of armchair soldiers who collected pay without ever seeing a battlefield. He was a statesman, a general, and a visionary, all things his sultan was not. He was Ahmed's shield, his mentor, the steady hand guiding a monarch still blinking in the unfamiliar light of power. In the summer of 1691, the fate of the empire marched with Fazıl Mustafa into Hungary. The objective was nothing less than the reversal of a decade of catastrophic losses. He aimed to reclaim the lands lost since the disastrous siege of Vienna, to push back the formidable Habsburg armies led by the brilliant, ruthless Louis William, Margrave of Baden. As the Grand Vizier prepared his vast army, he was acutely aware that he was not just leading soldiers. He was carrying the Sultan's trust, the court's expectations, and the future of the Ottoman presence in Europe. It was a burden heavy enough to break any man. And for Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, the breaking point was fast approaching. On August 19, 1691, near the town of Slankamen, where the Tisa River pours its waters into the mighty Danube, two worlds collided. The Ottoman army, a force of nearly 100,000 men, confident in their numbers and the leadership of their Grand Vizier, faced the smaller but highly disciplined imperial army. The Habsburg commander, Louis of Baden, known to the Turks as Turken Louis, Louis the Turk, had masterfully entrenched his forces, creating a formidable defensive position. He dared the Ottomans to attack. Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, a man who had never shied away from a challenge, accepted the bloody invitation. The battle began with the thunder of Ottoman cannonade. Janissaries, the elite of the army and the focus of Mustafa's reforms, charged forward with religious zeal. The fighting was brutal, a maelstrom of smoke, steel, and screams. For hours, the battle hung in a precarious balance. The Ottoman cavalry flanked the imperial lines, and for a moment, it seemed as if sheer numbers and ferocity might carry the day. But Louis of Baden was a master of defensive warfare, his lines bending but never breaking. The decisive moment came not from a grand strategy, but from a single, anonymous musket ball. As was his custom, Fazıl Mustafa Pasha was at the very front, rallying his troops, a beacon of courage in the chaos. A stray shot struck him in the forehead, killing him instantly. The beacon was extinguished. The news spread through the Ottoman ranks like a plague. Panic erupted. The commander, the visionary, the heart of the army, was gone. The disciplined force dissolved into a terrified mob. The Habsburg counterattack was merciless. It was no longer a battle. It was a slaughter. More than 20,000 Ottoman soldiers fell, including the Grand Vizier and the cream of his officer corps. The entire Ottoman camp, its vast war chest, and its sacred standards were captured. At Slankamen, the empire didn't just lose a battle, it lost its last, best hope. The news from Slankamen arrived at the palace in Edirne, not with the triumphant flourish of a victory dispatch, but with the stumbling, bloodied survivors who brought tales of unimaginable disaster. For Sultan Ahmed II, the report was more than a strategic catastrophe. It was a deeply personal wound. The man who had spent 4 decades in the silent isolation of the Kafes had placed his absolute faith in one individual. Fazıl Mustafa Pasha was not merely a minister. He was the Sultan's window to the world, his shield against the complexities of statecraft, the architect of a future Ahmed prayed for, but did not know how to build. The loss shattered him. Official court chronicles speak of the Sultan's profound sorrow, but his personal letters reveal a grief that bordered on despair. He lamented the loss of his vizier as a son would a father. "The pillar of my state has been broken," he wrote, his words echoing the profound sense of abandonment he now felt. This was a unique pain, born of a unique life. A lifetime of imprisonment had taught Ahmed to be pathologically distrustful. In the cafes, every kindness could be a prelude to betrayal. Every friendly face could mask an assassin's intent. Fazıl Mustafa had been the one man to break through that lifetime of suspicion. He had offered the new sultan not just loyalty, but competence, vision, and a genuine path forward. Now, he was gone, and the sultan was truly alone. He was no longer a new monarch shielded by a brilliant vizier. He was an inexperienced, middle-aged man, thrust into the center of a crisis he was utterly unprepared to handle. The defeat at Slankamen was a mortal blow to the empire's military, but the death of Fazıl Mustafa Pasha was a mortal blow to the sultan's soul. The cage had been opened, but now, adrift on a sea of intrigue and defeat, Ahmed II may well have longed for its terrible, simple certainty. With the death of Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, a great power vacuum opened at the heart of the Ottoman court, and into it rushed the vipers. The period of disciplined reform and singular purpose was over, replaced by the familiar venomous whispers of intrigue. The grieving and indecisive sultan was now prey. His choice for a new Grand Vizier was a man named Arabacha Ali Pasha, a figure who could not have been a more stark contrast to his predecessor. Where Fazıl Mustafa was a statesman, Ali Pasha was a court creature, skilled in the arts of survival and political assassination, but utterly lacking in vision or administrative talent. The atmosphere in the Seraglio grew thick with paranoia. Factions that had been suppressed by Fazıl Mustafa's strong hand now re-emerged, hungry for power and revenge. The ulama, the Janissary Agas, and the powerful figures within the harem all vied for influence over the bewildered sultan. Ahmed II, who had relied so completely on one man's counsel, was now surrounded by a chorus of self-serving advisors, unable to distinguish loyalty from flattery. Arabacha Ali Pasha, seeking to secure his position, began a brutal purge. He targeted the remaining officials and family members associated with the Köprülü clan, accusing them of treason, executing them, and confiscating their wealth to fill his own coffers. The war effort was neglected. Instead of rebuilding the shattered army and preparing for the next campaign against the Habsburgs, the new Grand Vizier focused on eliminating his domestic rivals. The empire, still bleeding from the wound of Slankamen, was now being poisoned from within. For Sultan Ahmed II, the throne had become a new kind of Kafes, one without bars, but infinitely more dangerous. He was a prisoner of his own court, surrounded by men whose ambitions threatened to consume what little remained of his fractured empire. While the vast plains of Hungary burned under the Habsburg advance, another fire was raging on the seas. To the south, the old maritime rival, the Republic of Venice, saw an opportunity. The Lion of St. Mark, once humbled, now roared again, its gaze fixed upon the jewel of the Aegean, the Morea, modern-day Peloponnese. The Great Turkish War was not merely a land conflict, it was a struggle for the soul of the Mediterranean. Under the brilliant and ruthless command of Francesco Morosini, the Venetian war machine, revitalized and emboldened by the Holy League, had already achieved stunning successes. Athens had been captured, the Parthenon tragically damaged by Ottoman munitions stored within. For Sultan Ahmed II, ascending the throne in 1691, this was an inherited nightmare. He was not just fighting the emperor in Vienna, he was fighting the Doge in Venice. The Ottoman navy, once the undisputed master of these waters, found itself outmaneuvered and outgunned. The Venetian galleasses, floating fortresses bristling with cannon, proved devastatingly effective against the lighter Ottoman galleys. The war became a bleeding wound, a constant drain on resources and morale. The most humiliating blow came in 1694, with the fall of Chios. This wealthy island, a stone's throw from the Anatolian coast, had been Ottoman for over a century. Its loss was a strategic and psychological catastrophe, exposing the heartland of the empire to naval raids. It sent a shockwave through Istanbul, a stark message that the empire was vulnerable, not just on its distant frontiers, but at its very doorstep. Ahmed, the recluse-turned-sultan, was forced to confront a reality his predecessors had never imagined. The sea, once an Ottoman lake, was now a battleground where the empire was losing. If the Venetian War was a bleeding wound, the conflict with the Habsburgs was a hammer blow, threatening to shatter the very foundations of Ottoman power in Europe. The momentum lost at the Siege of Vienna had never been regained. Instead, it had turned into a relentless, grinding retreat across the Hungarian plains. Sultan Ahmed II inherited this brutal reality, and with it, he inherited one of the last great statesmen of the Köprülü era, Grand Vizier Fazıl Mustafa Pasha. A man of immense talent and integrity, he was the empire's best hope. He had initiated sweeping reforms, stabilized the currency, and shown compassion to the Christian subjects of the Balkans, understanding that loyalty could not be won by the sword alone. In the summer of 1691, Fazıl Mustafa Pasha led the imperial army to confront the Habsburgs, commanded by the formidable Louis William, Margrave of Baden-Baden. The two forces met near Slankamen, on the banks of the Danube. It was a battle of titans, a desperate gamble to reverse nearly a decade of defeat. For a moment, it seemed the legendary Ottoman fighting spirit had been rekindled. The Janissaries and Sipahis fought with a ferocity not seen in years. But fate, as it so often does in these stories, intervened with cruel precision. At the height of the battle, a musket ball found its mark, striking Fazıl Mustafa Pasha in the forehead, killing him instantly. With his fall, the Ottoman command structure collapsed. The heart of the army was ripped out. Panic turned to rout, and the rout turned into a massacre. The Battle of Slankamen was more than a defeat. It was an apocalypse. The empire lost its most capable Grand Vizier, a significant portion of its veteran army, and any realistic hope of reclaiming Hungary. The Habsburg hammer had fallen, and its impact would echo through the remainder of Ahmed's reign, leaving him to rule over an empire reeling from a loss it could not absorb. Who was the man at the center of this storm? Before he was Sultan Ahmed II, he was simply Shehzade Ahmed, a prince confined for over 40 years to the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace, the Kafes. His world was not one of battlefields and statecraft, but of hushed corridors, intricate tilework, and the quiet scratch of a reed pen on paper. Ahmed was a man of culture and deep piety, a stark contrast to the martial world he was suddenly forced to command. His greatest passion, his most profound skill, was not in strategy, but in art. He was a master calligrapher, his hand capable of rendering the words of the Quran into forms of breathtaking beauty and spiritual depth. He spent decades perfecting his craft, finding solace and meaning in the precise, disciplined strokes of the Thuluth and Naskh scripts. His works, signed Ahmed bin Ibrahim Khan, were considered masterpieces. This was the man who, at the age of 48, was thrust onto the throne of a crumbling empire. Imagine the psychological dissonance. The hand that for a lifetime had known only the delicate art of calligraphy was now required to sign imperial decrees of war, to approve new taxes on a suffering populace, to confirm death sentences. He was known for his conscientiousness, his genuine desire to do right by his people. He would pore over state documents, trying to understand the intricate machinery of an empire he had only ever observed from a distance. He issued edicts against corruption and sought to alleviate the tax burden, but his efforts were like trying to mend a shattered vase with trembling hands. His reign is the ultimate tragedy of character versus circumstance. He was a gentle, artistic soul in an age that demanded a ruthless warrior. He possessed the refined hand of a calligrapher, but was cursed to rule in a time that required an iron fist. His personal piety and artistic sensitivity were not assets in this brutal game of survival. They were the very source of his profound and ultimately helpless dilemma. War is a voracious beast, and its favorite food is gold. For Ahmed II, the wars against the Holy League were not just consuming soldiers and territory. They were devouring the very wealth of the Ottoman Empire. The loss of Hungary, a a vast and fertile province, was a catastrophic blow to the imperial treasury. Decades of tax revenue, agricultural wealth, and mineral resources were now gone, feeding the Habsburg war machine instead. The state was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. In the Divan, the imperial council, the discussions were no longer about glorious expansion, but about desperate survival. The Grand Viziers who served Ahmed were forced to resort to ever more extreme measures to fund the armies in the field. The currency was repeatedly debased. The silver content of the akçe was reduced so drastically that it became almost worthless, sparking unrest and making trade a nightmare for common merchants. New, crushing taxes were levied on a population already struggling with hardship. These were known as the imdad-i seferiye, or campaign contributions, but they were effectively confiscations. Tax farmers, empowered by the state, squeezed every last coin from the peasantry. The crisis became so acute that the government took the unprecedented step of melting down non-essential gold and silver items from within the Topkapi Palace itself. Decorative plates, ornate ewers, and gilded objects, the accumulated treasures of generations of sultans, were fed into the furnaces to be minted into coin. It was a symbolic act of desperation, an empire consuming its own glorious past to pay for its calamitous present. For the common people, this was a time of profound suffering. The devalued currency meant the price of bread soared, and the new taxes left many destitute. The treasury was not merely empty. It was a treasury of tears, filled with the phantom value of a suffering populace and the melted ghosts of a more prosperous age. Ahmed II presided over this slow-motion collapse, a pious man watching his empire bleed out from 1,000 financial cuts. The throne room in Edirne was not a sanctuary for Ahmed II. It was a grander cage, haunted by more formidable ghosts. 43 years of near-total isolation had not emptied his mind, but filled it with phantoms. In the flicker of candlelight, he saw the faces of his brothers, Mehmed IV, deposed and disgraced, Suleiman II, his immediate predecessor, dead from the burdens of a throne he never wanted. He saw the ghosts of the 40 brothers and nephews his ancestor, Murad IV, had executed. These were the spectres of the Kafes, the silent companions of his long confinement. Every whisper from a courtier, every rustle of a curtain, could be the prelude to betrayal. The paranoia, once a tool for survival in the cage, was now a crippling liability on the throne. How could a man who had learned to trust no one now lead an empire that demanded absolute faith? This internal torment was mirrored by the external chaos. The Great Turkish War, a conflict inherited from his brothers, raged on, a relentless fire consuming the empire's western frontiers. Reports from the front were a litany of despair. The Habsburgs, those perennial thorns in the Ottoman side, were pushing deeper into the Balkans. The Venetians choked the Aegean. The Poles and Russians pressed from the north. For Ahmed, these were not just strategic setbacks. They were personal failures, confirmations of his inadequacy. He, who had spent a lifetime studying the Quran and practicing calligraphy, was now expected to be a Ghazi, a warrior sultan in the mold of his glorious ancestors. But the sword felt alien in his hand. The weight of the imperial turban felt heavier than any chains he had ever imagined in his gilded prison. The ghosts of past victories mocked him, while the future promised only the spectre of defeat. He was a man caught between two terrifying abysses, the memory of a power he could not comprehend and the fear of a collapse he could not prevent. The empire Ahmed II inherited was deeply unwell. The defeats on the battlefield were but a symptom of a more profound disease rotting the state from within. The treasury, once overflowing with the spoils of conquest, was perilously empty. The cost of the endless war was staggering, forcing the administration to resort to desperate measures. Taxes were raised to ruinous levels, debasing the currency became commonplace, and the confiscation of estates from disgraced officials was a regular, grim spectacle. This financial hemorrhaging starved the military. The Janissaries, the once unbeatable heart of the Ottoman army, were a shadow of their former selves. Their pay was often in arrears, their discipline was lax, and their loyalty was increasingly for sale to the highest bidder in the palace intrigues. The Sipahis, the provincial cavalry, had seen their land grants, the source of their power and livelihood, shrink or be usurped by corrupt officials. Ahmed II, for all his piety and good intentions, was helpless against this tide of decay. He placed his trust in his Grand Vizier, Köprülüzade Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, a man of immense talent and integrity. Fazıl Mustafa initiated sweeping reforms, attempting to stabilize the currency and root out corruption, but his efforts were a desperate attempt to patch a crumbling dam. The fatal blow came at the Battle of Slankamen in 1691. Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, the one man who might have been able to nurse the empire back to health, was killed in action. His death was more than a military loss, it was the death of hope. After him, a succession of less capable viziers cycled through the office, each unable to halt the decline. The sickness was too advanced. The court was a nest of vipers, with factions vying for influence while the frontiers burned. Ahmed, a man accustomed to the silence of the Kafes, was now surrounded by the cacophony of a dying empire, his decrees and pronouncements swallowed by the roar of its collapse. By the winter of 1694, the sickness of the empire had fully infected its ruler. Ahmed II was a broken man, not just in spirit, but in body. The years of inactivity in the Kafes had taken their toll, and the immense stress of his short reign had shattered his fragile health. He was afflicted with dropsy, or edema, a severe swelling that bloated his body, making every movement an agony. His court physicians were powerless, their remedies and incantations failing to halt the inevitable. The Sultan, who had ascended the throne as a middle-aged man, now looked ancient, his face a swollen mask of pain and exhaustion. He was largely confined to his chambers in the Edirne Palace, the war on the distant frontiers, a dull, throbbing ache in his mind. He knew his time was short. The question of succession, the very issue the Kafes was designed to manage, now loomed large. His own son was just a child. The clear heir was his nephew, the son of the deposed Mehmed IV, the future Mustafa II. In his final months, Ahmed's thoughts turned from the temporal to the eternal. He devoted his remaining energy to acts of charity and piety, perhaps seeking to balance the scales for a life of unearned privilege and a reign of unending failure. He issued decrees confirming charitable endowments and ensuring the welfare of religious foundations, as if trying to secure a legacy in heaven that he knew he would be denied on earth. His final decree was not one of war or statecraft, but one of acceptance. On February 6, 1695, after a reign of less than 4 years, Sultan Ahmed II surrendered to the one enemy no army could defeat. He died quietly, not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, but in his bed, a final, frail prisoner, released from the lifelong sentence of his royal blood. The caged prince, who had become a caged sultan, was finally free. History has not been kind to Ahmed II. He is often dismissed as a footnote, a weak and ineffectual ruler presiding over a period of decline. He won no great victories, commissioned no grand mosques, and left no lasting political reforms. By the traditional metrics of Ottoman greatness, his reign was an abject failure. But to judge him solely on this basis is to miss the profound and tragic lesson of his life. Ahmed II's true legacy is not what he did, but what he represented. He was the ultimate, tragic embodiment of the Kafes system. He was its masterpiece of dysfunction. The system, designed to prevent the fratricidal bloodshed of earlier centuries, had succeeded, but at a terrible price. It produced men who were not raised to rule, but merely to survive. It traded the risk of civil war for the certainty of mediocrity, and often incompetence. Ahmed was a pious, gentle, and intelligent man who might have lived a contented life as a scholar or a poet. Instead, he was thrust onto the most powerful throne in the Islamic world at a moment of existential crisis, with none of the training, experience, or psychological fortitude required for the task. His paranoia, his indecisiveness, his physical frailty, these were not innate character flaws, but the scars of 4 decades of sensory and social deprivation. His story reveals the deep rot that had set into the Ottoman dynasty. The principle of meritocracy that had once fueled the empire's rise had been replaced by a system that prioritized survival over ability. Ahmed II's failure was not his alone. It was the failure of a dynasty that had begun to devour its own. He is a ghost at the imperial banquet, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of Topkapi, a warning that in the quest for absolute security, a dynasty can sacrifice the very qualities needed to maintain its power, leaving a hollow crown for a broken man.